Elden Ring's DLC finally got announced, and here's why it was worth the wait. The DLC is called Elden Ring Shadow of the Erdtree, which shows Miquella as a child, and I think it could mean one of two things. One being we travel back in time and meet Miquella as a young child, or we somehow find a way to travel into the dream world of Miquella. There is quite a lot of speculation on both these theories, and I wanted to deep dive into both. But before that, I wanted to share why I am so hyped about Elden Ring DLC. So the original game was launched on Feb of 2022 and became an instant blockbuster with outrageously positive reviews, and it was the game of the year. And so I wanted to go back in time and talk about the past DLCs and their bosses to figure out what we can expect from the Elden Ring DLC and why the new bosses are such a huge deal. Now, as people say, best way to look at the future is by seeing the past, and to do that, I visited all the DLCs which came before Elden Ring. Now, before we talk of the games that did receive the DLC, let's touch on the two games which did not get it. One being Sekiro. However, it did get an update of sorts and the added Gauntlet of Strength, giving you an option to replay all the boss fights. And if you do manage to complete these challenges, you get some new skills and armor. And second being demonsouls, which was the first Souls game that released way back in 2009 and got a major remake in 2020. But unfortunately, no DLC. Now, let's talk about the games that did get DLC and why people who have been playing Souls games or Soulsborne games in the past are so excited about Elden Ring DLC. They don't just add new weapons or new armor, or just add some cosmetic things and make you play the game again, or maybe add some new play to win features that make the game easier. Nah, none of that nonsense in Soulsborne DLCs. They bring in content which in some cases is even better than the main game, which I'll show here. Now let's start with the very first DLC, Artorias of the Abyss, which was a follow-up to Dark Souls 1, which released around 10 months after the original game, and it had around 6 hours of playtime. But what it did add laid the foundation for the future with 6 new locations, some new armor, and 4 new bosses. 2 of them being Knight Artorias and Manus, Father of the Abyss, and it just felt a bit more advanced with better movesets than the bosses of the original Dark Souls. Now, let's move on to the next installment of the franchise of Dark Souls, Dark Souls 2. And it didn't have 1, not 2, but 3 DLCs. While the original Dark Souls 2 came out in March of 2014, the first DLC was released in July of 2014, and it was called Crown of the Sunken King, and it was followed by Crown of the Old Iron King in August and Crown of the Ivory King in September. So the DLC just came 4 months after the release of the original game, and from what I've heard, several of these bosses of these 3 DLCs are some of the best of Dark Souls 2. Now coming to my favorite of all, Dark Souls 3, which in my humble opinion is the best of all, not just for the main game, but also for the DLCs. And it didn't just add 1, but 2 DLCs. Now the main game came out in April of 2016, and the main story had a runtime of 32 hours. Following that, Ashes of Ariandel, the first DLC, released the same year, which granted didn't offer too long a playtime with approx of 4 hours of gameplay, and it just had 1 location, the Painted City of Ariandel, which is actually a very big area, so it's not right on my part to say just 1 location. But what it did add was one of the finest infamous bosses of all Soulsborne games, Sister Friede. Wow, I mean, this boss fight is so interesting. It has some of the finest of mechanics. She has 3 phases of absolute savagery. She brings in Father Ariandel in the second phase of the fight, and in the third phase she just turns into this speed demon, Black Flame Friede. That third phase tests even the most pro or veteran Souls game player. It literally looked like a boss from BloodBorne coupled with the slow mechanics of Dark Souls, and granted it was quite a small DLC, but you should just experience it for Sister Friede. Now coming to the second DLC, Ring City, and this is my favorite DLC of any Souls game, and all for just one reason: the bosses. Oh my word, it has some of the most toughest bosses in any Souls games. The first major boss is 2 demons, Demon of Pain and Demon from Below, and then there is a second phase where they transform into Demon Prince, and his power is dependent on whom you beat first. But it's a fun and fair fight because you never feel overrun by 2 of them, as one is always more aggressive than the other, and it's a really cool fight to experience. And then it's the 2 big final bosses. First off, Midir, and no dragon fight of Elden Ring is even half as challenging as this one. And I have lost count to how many times I have raged quit midair. And even now I'm of the opinion it's not a very fun fight. It's quite tedious. I mean, his health bar is, I guess, double of any other boss. Then comes the final boss of Ring City, which is such a fitting finale to an amazing franchise, which is till date my favorite boss of any game, Slave Knight Gael. Now this is a boss that you have to experience. It's an extremely tough but fair fight, and you have to understand all his moves to be able to dodge, cause he's that fast. But I had the biggest smile on my face while fighting him. He is super aggressive, has strong AoE attacks. I mean, it is my favorite, absolute favorite boss, and if you want to watch that, I have linked that boss fight in the description below. Let's move to the fan favorite DLC of FromSoft. Let's talk about BloodBorne, which is quite the fan favorite for many of you. The main game was launched in March of 2015, and it had only one DLC which came out in November of 2015, so again just 8 months after the original game, and it was called Old Hunters. And it introduced 4 new locations and added new weapons and 5 new bosses, which in my opinion are better than the bosses of the original game. Well, at least 3 of them, and they are Ludwig the Holy Blade, Lady Maria of the Astral Clocktower, and Orphan of COS, which according to many is still the toughest boss of any Souls game, even after millennia. So there's a theme with all these DLCs, and that's the bosses. Be it Lady Maria, who is an absolute fan favorite, or Orphan of COS, who is still considered the toughest boss of any game, or Ludwig, the Holy Blade. They are all top tier boss fights, even now after Elden Ring. So now you know all the hype surrounding Elden Ring DLC, because the last DLC that came out from that company had some of the biggest, baddest and the best fights of any Souls game. From Artorias to Manus to Sister Friede and Gael in the Souls game, to Ludwig to Orphan of COS and Lady Maria of the Astral Clocktower in BloodBorne, and then add in the weapons, the spells, the armor, and the interesting locations and lore. We have a lot to be excited about right now, because Elden Ring, Game of the Year, a game which is widely regarded as the best game ever, is coming with a DLC from a company whose last 2 DLCs, that is Dark Souls 3 and BloodBorne, were absolutely top tier S-class. So coming to now, after a long wait, the DLC was finally announced with this image. At first glance I thought that was Queen Marika, with the flowing golden hair, but on closer inspection, the general consensus is that it's Miquella, which is strange because all the item descriptions say that Miquella is a he. However, he has a feminine alter ego called Saint Trina, which basically means 2 things. It's either we travel back in time when Miquella was still a young child, or this is a dream sequence inside Miquella's head. More like an alternate reality of sorts. And I personally feel it's the second, because this does not look like the lands between. The wheat fields are too vast and the landscape too low as compared to the mountains of the lands between. So if this is true, and I really hope it is, because then we are surely fighting Godwyn. Because Miquella was already trying to revive Godwyn, who was killed by the assassins with black knives, as in this image, which was imbued by the death rune which Rani stole. And what gives more credence to this argument is based on some very specific images. As you see, a tree is wrapping around the Earth tree, almost strangling it, and that tree closely resembles the death root, which came into being after Godwyn's death, wherein his soul was corrupted and he became the Prince of Death. And as a result, death root was formed as the disrupted sap of the Earth tree. So the obvious question is, what kind of a fight will it be? Now if you see the Chinese version of the alpha test for Elden Ring, it is quite different from the rest, as there are these strange sea monsters all across the map. And if my theory is right, and if we fight Godwyn, we might have to fight these sea monsters as well. Now let's try and answer who's going to be the finale boss. Now in this video I did mention about Miquella's alter ego, and I truly believe Saint Trina might be the final boss fight. And judging by the history of all the DLC finale boss fights, we are surely up for a treat. Which begs the question, what sort of a final boss fight can we expect? Well, judging by this image from Elden Ring, this basically tells us that Saint Trina will have a sword or a staff which will have some sort of a sleep power or spell, which could mean a truly unique fight, something we haven't seen in Elden Ring. But that's not all. I truly believe that the penultimate boss fight would involve a beast, because of the 4 Empyreans, 2 of which, Rani and Marika, have their own beasts in Blade and Clergyman. So surely both Empyreans, Miquella and Malenia, have their own beasts as well. So we could see a duos fight where we fight against two beasts, which honestly could be the toughest boss fight of the game. So, in conclusion, learning from the past DLCs and from what I am expecting from the Shadow of the Earth tree, we could see some of the best and toughest bosses we have ever fought, and I cannot wait to get my hands on this DLC. But I do believe we'll have to wait a while because Armored Core is releasing in August, and no ways will they sabotage their own game, because given the option I would choose Elden Ring over Armored Core any day. So I'm expecting the worst but hoping for the best. However, with all that being said, this is speculative and I would love to hear and respond to what you think and what you are looking forward to the most in this DLC. Thank you for watching, and do like and subscribe for more such gaming content.